welcome to the second day of our Music Without Borders, Armenians and Their Neighbors, Acoustic Connections Over Time and Space. And we had a wonderful session last night. We're very excited about today's marathon. It's still strange doing this in a blended way, but already I can see we've got people from all over the States and Europe, and that's a great thing. So I'll stop complaining about Zoom. I need to let you know that we are recording. So if you are concerned about your image being seen, then please use the icon to stop your video, and you'll still be able to hear everything. But we like to see your images, so please, if you don't mind, leave them on. This is put on by the Armenian Institute with the music department of the King's College London. And I'm here with my co-organizer, Martin Stokes. I'm Susan Pattie from the Armenian Institute, Martin from King's College London. This little moment of time that we've got right now before we will actually start at 1:15 with the presentations by Jacob and Aram. We thought if we have a few minutes, we weren't sure because we have so much to, and this doesn't have a time thing. What time is it?
6 minutes past.
Yeah. Does anybody have any comments or things they want to ask each other or us before we begin? We will start right at 1:15 as people are gathering, but we thought that, or Martin, do you want to say a couple words before we start?
No, not at all. Hello, everyone. Very nice to see everyone. Yeah, we're going to keep the chat function open, so please do feel free to comment as we go along. Not just questions that you might want to ask the speakers, but things that you might want to address to Susan and me. And we'll do our best to keep our eyes on the comments as well. We're anxious to get, or we're interested to get your sort of ongoing thoughts and feedback. Lovely to see everybody. We're talking across 3 continents here, and I suppose in a weird way we've got the virus to thank for this. We've sort of got used to this hybrid online life. In a funny kind of a way, it's made this conference possible. So last night had a rather wonderful session with Melissa Bilal and Harut Arakelian, telling us about their research, which I thought beautifully addressed the themes of this about music without borders, connections over time and space, and they were both talking about very connective individuals, Koharik Kazarasian and the early entrepreneurs, I suppose you could say, of the early Armenian recording industry. It was a fascinating discussion, and it was just so nice to be able to connect people in Yerevan, one side of the planet, and in Los Angeles on quite the other. So I too am looking forward to the day. Thanks everyone for coming, and just looking forward to presentations and the conversations and comments as and when you want to provide them.
Trying to type on this strange thing while Martin was talking, excuse me. Yes, please put your questions in the link. And I'm sorry it was all in caps. I didn't mean to shout at you. So do we have any questions already? Let's see. And we have.
As we're looking, we thought it was worth reiterating something that I said yesterday, which was that we've started off and been very careful in all of our communications and titling of things to avoid any assumptions that we all know what Armenian music is. It's a challenging concept. And I think that we're all working with our own definitions and working towards better definitions of what this is. And our conversations already have been focused less on what Armenian music is and more on the processes, I suppose you could say, by which music is being claimed as, or being labeled as, or understood as, or being as Armenian. I mean, these are historical processes, social processes, cultural processes, which we can answer in a way. But we work with no substantive definition of Armenian music itself. And I think the range of presentations that we have over the course of the next few hours, I think, will be testimony to that.
I'd like to just try to answer Ara Krikorian's question he's asking about the Armenian musical that was part of Harut's presentation last night. He says he was surprised to find it was an Azerbaijani musical first performed in Baku. Harut did say that last night. And actually, you have to remember that Baku was a very much more international, cosmopolitan, diverse place at that, up until that year, and just beyond that year, things changed radically after that in Armenia as well. The whole world was very different than in the Caucasus. The whole world in the Caucasus. There was a world in the Caucasus that was very different than it is today. So that's as much as I can say right now. Harut is probably sleeping, so we'll keep that for later on. And along with that, we want to say thank you to Aline, who is writing to us from California at 5 o'clock in the morning. So we're impressed and very grateful. That's dedication, I'd say. But I believe that Melissa and Harut said they would be catching us later on today. And a question about whether we're going to be able to access recordings afterwards. Yes, some of the recordings will be put up on YouTube. Nick, please correct me if I'm wrong. And some of them, the ones in the afternoon today, we will ask they'll all be recorded and will be available for researchers. As far as going up to the general public, that will depend on the speakers and what they decide after today. So yes, we're in the process of doing all of that. Oh, sorry, Olivia's already answered these things. Thanks, Olivia. Okay. And why don't we have a session on Georgian music? Just very simply because things were, and I'm sorry, Michael, we've met before, and you're a great musician yourself. We had to reduce the size of our whole thing. We had big plans before, and so we couldn't include everything. So I'm sorry, that's a really lame excuse, but it's not possible to include all neighbors. We also don't have a Jewish session, or lots of Greek session, lots of other things. Yeah. So okay, I'm gonna have to leave it to Olivia then to keep answering the questions. Thanks, Olivia, who's off site today. And I'm going to, I think,
2 minutes until
we'll be turning over to, I'm going to switch places with Nick, who is our program manager. Oh, okay. All right. We learn something new every day. So we don't have to physically change places. We're just going to mute and unmute, and he'll take over. So, thank you. We have a final comment here which says, as a Polish person, I can definitely agree with international case of community in Baku in the early 20th century. Yes, Baku was a very, very different place than it is today. And indeed, as many of you know, or lots of you know, the Armenians cultural center was probably Tiflis, was not Yerevan in any case. So all of these things changed post World War I and with the advent of the Soviet Union. So these are all interesting things that are background, but absolutely still important today in so many different ways. Well, I think it's probably 1:15, so I think it's time to start our first session just a reminder, please, to anybody who's newly joined us, please put your questions in the chat line, and we will come to those after the two presenters have talked to us. And just to remind you that we are recording. You will be muted, everybody, until we're ready to have some kind of conversation much later on. Okay, I'm going to introduce Nick. We're very fortunate to have Nicholas with us today because he's not only a great scholar and a wonderful program manager and fundraiser for AI, but he knows about tech. So I feel in good hands today with him here and with Olivia Melkonyan, who is working from home today. It's fantastic to have these people taking care of us today. So Nick, in his other life, or with his other hats on, is a social historian and a political activist. He's been educated at the universities of Edinburgh and Oxford, and his research focuses on the medieval Middle East through Armenian material. And his research projects include a forthcoming study and translation of the 11th century Armenian historian Aristakis Lastivertsi and a global history of the city of Ani. And could I just say that if you look on our AI YouTube channel, I think you'll find Nick's lectures. Nick, is that right? About Ani? Good. Yeah, I knew they were there. I just don't know what sort of comes and goes, but they're well worth checking out. He's also an activist, as I mentioned, and he focuses on political and economic issues in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. So Nick will be chairing our first session today, and I'm going to leave it then to Nick to introduce our speakers.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Susan, for a really kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be chairing the first session of a really exciting program today, and I won't take up any more time with my own thoughts, and just will introduce our first speaker, Aram Kerovpyan. Aram was born in 1953 in Istanbul, Turkey, and as a youth he apprenticed under a church cantor. He learned to play the kanun and learned the Middle Eastern modal system with Master Saadeddin Öktenay, who was born in 1930 and passed away in 1989. And after gaining a degree in electrical engineering, he moved to Paris in 1977 and thereafter dedicated himself entirely to music. Aram co-founded the ensemble Chant in 1981, and in 1986 became the assistant to master singer Arabian in the Armenian Cathedral of Paris, St. John the Baptist. In 1990, Aram succeeded Arabian as master singer for the Armenian Cathedral of Paris. He is the founder and director of the Center for Armenian Modal Chant Studies of Paris and the Ensemble Aachen, and holds a PhD in musicology from the École Pratique des Études, also in Paris, and publishes lectures and performs, as well as directing workshops on Armenian modal chant with his wife, Virginia, Pattie, Kerovpyan. So thank you so much for joining us today, Aram, and I'll hand it over to you to start us off for the day.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the whole staff of the Armenian Institute for organizing this. In any case, it will be very brief, my presentation. I can share that, can't I? Yeah. I am not going to present a new research today. I will be talking about a subject which was studied quite a lot, but maybe not enough yet. But at the end, there will be a link with my new work. I will talk about it briefly. So let's go. Okay, it's about the modern Armenian notation system, which is known in Turkey as Hampartsoum Notation, and many Armenians use also this term. I prefer using the modern Armenian notation term. And at the beginning, it was called church notation. So it was invented, as many of you know, at the beginning of the 19th century, and it allowed quite from the beginning the transcription of liturgical repertoire, and then for a certain extent the folk music collections. And all the songs which had survived orally until then were many versions of them have been possible to transcribe. It also served to transcribe Ottoman classical music works. I'm not going to talk about its history, but I will remind just a few points of its history, because from a long time now, for a long time now, there is some mythology, some legends, which are still going on, and it's never enough to repeat them. So only 2 points. This myth has 2 elements. When one of them is the circumstances of its creation, and the second is the confusion about the date of its when it was created. So in Turkey, still you can still read or hear that this notation was created on the order of the Sultan Selim II, who asked Baba Hampartsoum to create this notation. This is completely false, because Sultan Selim was already had lost his throne for a few years when this notation was created. Armenians don't mention the Sultan, but they say Baba Hampartsoum did this to save the Armenian melodies from Turkish influence, which is completely also false, I can say. The main reason was that as a consequence of westernization, the idea of conservation of repertoire, of musical repertoires, had made its way through the intelligentsia, especially of Istanbul, not only Armenians. And there was a real need to be able to notate in a modern way, in the modern way of that time, melodies. So the fiction is still effective. This is why I wanted to say a few words about it. So the system was created around the years 1811, 1812. And it was a collective work, not only Baba Hampartsoum. There was the guitarist father Miras Pezeshkian, Andon Amira Düzyan, and Hagop Çelebi Düzyan, and 4 of them have did this work. The creation of this notation was almost immediately followed by the creation of the New Byzantine notation known as Chrysanthos notation. It was, if I'm not wrong, if there hasn't been corrected the date, it's around 1814. So the original system of the notation had many signs. The authors wanted to indicate as many situations as possible. Excuse me? Did I? No. So they wanted to transcribe all the modal degrees, and not only the modal degrees, but also interpretational signs. This is the original list taken from the manuscript of the father Pezeshkian, and there are many more signs than the system used today. And this is also his list of interpretational signs, and almost all of them have been left aside, put aside. I think all of them. And the system was reformed a few decades after it was reformed. Now, in the original system, on the first line, you see the main picture, the main degrees. And on the second line, you see they call the half, approximately half degrees. And in between the main degrees and the half degrees, there is a third line, and with other signs. It is these signs have been put aside, and the system became a very simple one. Now, and it was so simple that many people ask the question if it's really does it serve to something or not, this notation, and and sometimes we still hear that question. Now, the signs come from the ancient Khaz notation, pneumatic notation. You see, they look like, many of them look like them, and the aim was to avoid the visual disruption for the church cantors, and to ensure a smooth passage from the use of Khaz notation to the modern notation. And this the rudimentary character of the notation offered a tool that was easy to use during offices, because this notation would be used during offices, and it was the fact that it was so rudimentary was completely in parallel with the fact that the cantors were trained in modal singing, and they needed a visual help, especially for melismatic songs, which were more difficult to memorize. This is probably the reason why the manuals to teach the notation were so simple. They were sometimes so simple that it looks like ridiculous, but they had their role. So the songs were the songs collected were transcribed quite easily. This is a collection made, a page from a collection made by a famous master singer. And this is the handwriting of my master singer, Aram Kerovpyan. You see, it's hardly readable, but it did its work. Now, whatever the theoretical setting of the time may have been at different times, you know, the theories change all the time, and the music changes all the time, modes change, the pitches change, many things change with the time. Whatever it was, all the modes in use were and still are based on unequally divided intervals. So a simple notation like this must then indicate several modal situations, modal degrees with the same sign, because the big number of signs would make the notation more complicated and more difficult to use. So if we see this scale, which is incomplete. By the way, I do not explain modes by scales, but by interacting intervals. This is a very, let's say, rough and theoretical thing. As you see, many different situations are explained with the same sign. And if we go a little more into detail, here we will spend a few minutes. On the left, you see in Western signs some intervals used in the Armenian octoikos or the music sung or played by Armenians in general. You see, and in the middle, I put I use the Modern Armenian notation, but under each sign I put a signal, a sign which corresponds to the function of that degree. For example, on top, the first one would be shows the basic, the base, the drone degree, and which is also the base of the mode. And then you have on this page you have variable degrees. You have degrees that carry to other degrees, and you have degrees which are the leading, what you would call in Western world the leading notes. So as you see that here the red flashes show the difference, the different functions of the degrees, and on the right column, and you see how we write them. We use the same sign to explain all these differences. And in the blue flashes, arrows, sorry for the French, the blue arrows show the pitches which do not necessarily change, but their function change. And still, we show them, we transcribe them with the same sign. So this notation system is now used by very few people, and many people think it's obsolete. And in fact, what is obsolete is the notation system doesn't become obsolete just like that. When it is less used, it is because the teaching of the model system has deteriorated. If the person does not master the model system, all these interpretational differences which come from the structure of the intervals, and which come from the way we use these intervals. In this case, of course, any notation would just become something that shows a melody which is in the air, and not a mode which is a movement of sounds, in fact, another scale. So this situation is quite flagrant now. It's both for people using Western notation or the modern Armenian notation. It's the teaching of the modality which is decreasing, and this is why any notation system would only transmit just melody. And melodies, as you know, they can be anywhere. You can find in both ends of the world the same melody. It doesn't mean much. To finish, I will say that this is the subject of my new work. That I'm very slow, but I'm trying to do it. I'm trying to prepare a manual of which is about this problem, and to tell that reading notes or reading theory doesn't allow you to be trained in modal music. You can go on the theory after the practice. Once you feel on your skin what's going on, or with these different situations, and then the mind can do something, can understand. Otherwise melodies remain always ephemeris. This is that's all I have to say today. Try to be very brief, and if you have any questions, go ahead. And I want to remind you that a few people present here have know at least as much as me, if not more, about the system. One of them is Jacob. It's not his subject today, I think. And the other one is Haygu Tijian. They're both present. And even, I would say, Altuğ Yılmaz knows a lot of these things, although he pretends he doesn't know anything. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Aram. Really nice introduction to the topic and opening up for today. And there's already been some questions in discussion. I should say this event, we're here to hear from experts and people who know this. And please don't feel intimidated by any questions that you might have. However simple or complex that you feel they are, please do ask them. We want this event to be as inclusive and for all levels of knowledge. I certainly know next to nothing about these topics, and I'm excited to find out more. Not least from our next speaker, Dr. Jacob Olley. Jacob is a Leverhulme early career research fellow in the Faculty of Music at the University of Cambridge. His current research project there is Debating Music in the Ottoman Press, 1876 to 1928. And this focuses on discussions of music in Turkish language periodicals during the final decades of the Ottoman Empire. The project seeks to understand how debates about music became a site for historical and social critique among Muslim intellectuals, and how they relate to broader global entanglements between Europe and Asia during the long 19th century. Before joining Cambridge, Jacob was a research associate on the digital publication project Corpus Musicae Ottomanicae, critical editions of Near Eastern music manuscripts, based at the University of Münster in Germany. And before that, his PhD thesis at King's formed a cultural history of notation systems, so you see the connection today, in Ottoman music, focusing on the invention of modern Armenian Hampartsoum notation in the 19th century. So I'll hand over to you, Jacob, please. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nick. Let me just share my screen, or in fact, before I do that, I just want to say thank you to Susan and to Martin for putting this together, and to say as well that this research, which I'm going to present, which goes back to my PhD thesis, so a lot of people who contributed to that, a lot of people helped with that, probably half the people in this room helped in some form with that research. But I'd particularly like to say thank you to Aram, Kerovpyan, who I think for most people in this field, our research wouldn't be possible without what he has contributed, and to Haig as well, who I'm very happy to see here. And I would like to mention, to say thank you to Melissa Bilal as well. I don't think she's here today. Yeah, so I'm going to talk today about some interactions, so the history of musical interactions between the Armenian and the Muslim communities in the Ottoman period in Istanbul, especially during the 19th century. I'll say a bit about what happened before the 19th century as well. So I'm going to focus on three things. I'm not going to cover everything because that wouldn't be possible. So I'll first talk about the court. So the repertoire of the court and the relationship of non-Muslims and especially Armenians to that repertoire. I'll then say something about the adoption of new technologies and cultural forms during the 19th century, and thirdly, I'll say something about the adoption of modern Armenian notation, or Hampartsoum notation. So there's a couple of conceptual points that I want to bear in mind when thinking about music interactions between these two communities. So firstly, historicity or historical specificity. So these, the interactions have different dynamics in different historical periods, and broadly speaking, there's a sort of closer or more intensive contacts as the 19th century progresses, and that has to do with particular social, political developments during that period. The other thing to think about is the variety of ways in which these interactions could have happened. So we're talking about two communities, but there's a lot of different subgroups, a lot of genres, musical genres, social spaces, performance spaces, from the court to the church to the theatre and so on. So these different
spaces show different degrees and different types of interaction as important to remember that variability. And then thirdly, related to that, the question of directionality, which is to say power. So the type of interaction could that could in some cases constitute a kind of exchange, but in many other cases it could be a process of domination or assimilation or appropriation. So there's a lot of different ways that contacts and interactions happen between these communities. Yeah, so firstly, going back to the 17th century, to the middle of the 17th century, we have a very small number of Armenian musicians who are mentioned in the Ottoman sources. So Evliya Çelebi, for example, who's someone who's very interested in music, who talks a lot about music, gives a lot of data, a lot of names, but he actually only mentions three musicians of Armenian origin. So that's sort of generally true before the 19th century, that the court tradition, the courtly tradition, especially the vocal tradition, that was pretty much dominated almost exclusively by Muslim performers and Muslim composers. You do find a few non-Muslim instrumentalists. Some of them became very famous, people like Tamburi Isak, Kimani Georgi, from the Armenian community. There's not sort of famous composers in the same way that you have cases like Isak from the Jewish community or Georgi from the Greek community. So there's only one piece in the instrumental repertoire before the 19th century, which is attributed to an Armenian composer. So generally the core repertoire, and like I said, especially the vocal repertoire, that was a pretty exclusive kind of tradition. So that partly had to do with the language, the poetic language. So the sort of bestes and chars and things like that, the kind of classical repertoire, core classical repertoire was a sort of high literary Turkish that was not very accessible to non-Muslims. You had to have a certain type of education, whether at the palace, in the palace bureaucracy, or in madrasa education, that you just didn't have if you were Christian or Jewish. So a few cases like this, where we see an Armenian scribe who has written down the lyrics to a piece of court music, a Turkish vocal piece, the language is quite corrupted in this process of transcription, and it suggests that he wasn't someone who really knew the poetic language very well. So the court tradition was had some kind of institutional barrier to participation by non-Muslims. I'm speaking specifically about the court, about the palace. So there's other contexts which we will see more context, but specifically at the court, the musicians who were employed directly by the court, by definition, were Muslim, because the ruling class was Muslim, and that was how the system worked before the 19th century. So the palace musicians were Muslim, and then you then had some other musicians who lived in the city, who came from outside the palace, and who could be invited to the palace to perform for the Sultan, and that included Muslims, and it included Armenians and Greeks as well. But they had a different sort of status to the palace. To the palace musicians, so they were in some sense excluded or marginal. So this changes.
situation changes in the middle of the 19th century, and that has to do with the whole process of reform. So most of the institutions, the state institutions, were reformed as part of the Tanzimat, and the sort of one of the sort of the intentions of the Tanzimat was to give legal equality between Muslims and non-Muslims, which was not always effective in practice, but at least theoretically that was one of the intentions of these reforms. So so at this point you start seeing non-Muslims who were employed by the palace directly, and in fact about half of the instrumental ensemble by the middle of the 19th century, about half of that ensemble is made up of non-Muslims. However, the vocal ensemble, which is the Muezzinani Hassa, that was still dominated by Muslims because as a vocalist at the palace, your primary duty was to recite the calls of prayer, to recite the Quran, as well as singing the secular repertoire. So something else that occurred because of these reforms was the introduction of a European Western-style military band, and we have reports from that time, from when that band was first established in around about 1828. So a Scottish traveller who was there at that time says that most of the musicians in this band were in fact Armenians when it was first established, and then later they were replaced by Muslims from the palace. So the fact that you have these Armenians who are playing, they're in the first kind of European style band at the palace, that has to do with their diasporic connections with Europe. So because of those historic connections, they were more likely to be familiar with European music. So that's something that is reflected in some other areas as well. So for example, in printing. So the Armenian community were very active in printing in general, and specifically in the printing of music, and this is included for the Greek community as well, as Eleni Kalimopoulou has pointed out recently. Some of the collections that were printed by the Greek community. For example, this one published in 1856, that was actually printed by Davidian, so by an Armenian printer, and the Armenians printed song text collections as well in Turkish and Armenian script, such as this collection published in 1865. They were also the first. They were the first community to publish staff notation. So European staff notation was first published in Istanbul by the Armenians, although in Turkey it's commonly assumed that this happened in the 1870s. In fact, the Armenians had started this printing activity in the 1850s and the 1860s, about 20 years before Muslim publishers started to publish in Western staff notation. The other thing is that these publications by people like Haji Amin, so Muslim publishers, they also used Armenian printing houses because they had the technology, they had the skills to publish staff notation. So this sort of process of the kind of translation or the transfer of these European technologies into the Ottoman Empire, this this happens in several different areas, so in printing and in musical theatre and opera, and the performance and composition of Western music in general in Istanbul is dominated by Armenians during the 19th century. So the first opera or the first operetta in Turkish was, of course, composed by Churchian, by an Armenian, and the discussions in the Turkish press at this time, so in the 1870s, the first kind of discussions about music sort of criticism, these discussions are almost entirely focused on Churchian and another theatre company, Vartovian, so Gulakop's theatre company. So they were incredibly important in this area. I'm not sure how I've sort of lost track of time, but I'll just finish by saying something about Hampartsoum Notation. I'll try and keep it brief. Yeah, so when this system was first invented, it was intended, according to Pattie and Limongian, and says something similar, that was intended not just for church music, but it was thought that it would be suitable for the music of other communities as well. So it has lots of elements which are drawn from Ottoman music. But the tambour was the point of reference for the pitch system and so on. And lots of examples given by Pattie are taken from the Ottoman repertoire, especially the instrumental repertoire. But it was used, well, perhaps we could come to this in the discussion, but it seems to me that most of the collections from the first half of the 19th century are basically the instrumental repertoire, the Ottoman instrumental repertoire. So this is an example of that, which is probably, in my opinion, by Limongian, and it contains exclusively Pesherev's and Sasinois' a secular Ottoman repertoire. So the question is, how would someone like Limongian learn this repertoire if he couldn't go to the court? He couldn't be employed at the court. Well, probably at the Mevlevi-hane. So the Mevlevi-hane was a bit more open in terms of accessibility to non-Muslims, and there is evidence as well that it was a place where non-Muslims could actually perform, at least the instrumentalists, not the vocalists. So this is probably where someone like Limongian would have learned this repertoire. Conversely, the notation system itself was adopted first by the Mevlevis. So the first Muslim musicians to adopt Hampartsoum notation were Mevlevis, not just because they were interested in theory, they were interested in notation. So by the final quarter of the 19th century, it had been adopted by some Muslim musicians, and Discussant comments on this and says, well, that the Armenian teachers were reluctant to teach it to foreigners, to non-Armenians. However, some of them had learned the system, and this contributed to the perception within the Muslim community that this was an Ottoman notation system, so it wasn't an Armenian system. It started to be referred to as Ottoman or Turkish notation. So there's a level of ignorance amongst the Muslim community about the origins of this notation system, which can be seen in the 19th century already. So Haji Amin, for example, mentions that the notation system was based on the Armenian alphabet, which is still commonly supposed today. So this misconception that is based on Armenian letters, this existed in the 19th century. Now the thing is that Haji Amin actually had contact with, for example, Levon Hanjian, who wrote a preface to this publication. He published things with Zartarian as well, so he collaborated professionally with Armenian musicians, but that didn't necessarily mean that he had any kind of knowledge about the cultural background of the notation system. So by the end of the 19th century, this notation system was referred to explicitly as Turkish Alaturk. It became Turkish notation, at least for Muslim musicians. And just to finish the last couple of slides, this you start to see at the sort of turn of the 20th century, in the first decade of the 20th century, Muslim musicians like Ralph Yekta start to feel a kind of embarrassment or anxiety about the Armenian origins of the notation system. So Ralph Yekta emphasizes that there were Turkish notation systems, by which he means Persian or Arabic, that were used before Hampartsoum notation. And finally, so this is in 1919, so post-genocide, it's Ralph Yekta who publishes the first kind of substantial article about Turkish or Ottoman music in French, where he doesn't mention Hampartsoum notation, he doesn't mention the Armenians. At the same time, he invents a new notation system that he calls Turkish notation, or Milli notation, national notation, which structurally is exactly the same as Hampartsoum notation, but he gets rid of the Armenian symbols and replaces them with the Arabic scripts. So it's a sort of clear process of erasure of the Armenian cultural elements within that tradition. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for that really interesting paper, and thank you to both of you for opening the day so wonderfully, illustrating that the Armenian tradition is neither frozen and unchanging, nor in standing isolation from all of the traditions that it intersects with. So I'm sure you've got lots of questions. There are a couple that have come up already. So maybe I'll start with those. So one question from and both of these can be answered by either of you. So please. The first from Ali Kerovpyan asks, since we have no documentation for the musical notation of the charagans of the medieval period, how confident can we be in the accuracy of the melodies when we're playing this music today? And this is obviously an issue that's shared by a number of how we read early music, both in the Byzantine and the Latin world. And a second question on a slightly different topic from George Mura asks how these stories that we've heard of the adoption of this notation in the metropoles, so to speak, in Constantinople and in Tiflis, relates to parallel spheres of music and representations in public or in print in Cilicia, for example, during these periods in Adana, in Tarsus, in Iskenderun, or even in Antep or Hatay. So I guess more broadly, that's a question about the relationship between the sort of core and the periphery in these parts. So please, Jacob or Aram, whoever wants to start there.
Jacob, I can more easily answer the first question. The second one, I didn't get the whole thing. For the medieval melodies, I mean, worrying about medieval melodies and wanting absolutely to have a link with them is it's kind of it sits in the ideology of national music. It's that approach which demands you that you link your music or other aspects of your culture to the times with no beginning, to establish your nation making idea. Whereas melodies, they change all the time. melodies change, modes change, interpretation systems change, everything changes with the time. And if it doesn't change, it dies. So it has changed all the time. And the transcriptions we have from the 19th century are like photographies taken at that time. And although they were transcribed during the 19th, mostly during the last quarter of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century, and after also they did, they never remained the same. I mean, we have lots of thousands of pages of transcriptions, and we each sing according to our tradition, according to how we learned from our masters. So nothing is fixed. This is why it's the how they would have sung during medieval times. It's a pure research topic, and mostly unsolvable, I think. For example, for the Gregorian chant, there has been changes in the writing of there's been several different notation system, and each time they have transcribed anew with the new system, and that's how some of the melodies, in a certain way, they went through centuries. But for the biggest part of the world, this is probably not true, and it has no practical use unless you absolutely want to establish your national music with 3,000 years of roots, which is personally not my work.
Yeah, perhaps I'll just say something quickly in relation to George's question. I see he's dropped his son off, so he's back. Yeah, so I think it depends on the type of repertoire that you're looking at. So as I said, I'm sort of focusing on the core repertoire, but I think in other sort of more vernacular, more popular spheres, you can see points of contact in sort of print culture that would happen not just in Istanbul, but in other regional centers. And yeah, for example, places like Tiflis, and I wanted to mention actually someone I don't know if is here today, but it would be great on another occasion to hear him speak, a PhD student in Cologne called Jonas Löffler, who's looking at music in Tiflis around 1900 and the interactions between Azeri and Armenian groups. So that's not something that I've looked at personally, but I'm sure there's kind of plenty of potential for that sort of research.
Thank you both. We have another question from David Kerovpyan, who notes that modern Arabic music uses many makams and has an elegant way of noting flats, sharps, half sharps, one comma, diminished, and augmented notes, all of which apply to Armenian music. But somehow Armenian music seems to have lost this same ability, which suggests is by adopting tempered tunings. But maybe if you could say a bit more on why that process happened, or if you agree with that understanding of it.
Is it to me, the question?
Yes, please.
Well, by the term Armenian music, already it's half of the answers. By the term Armenian music, we should understand the music of the Republic of Armenia and former Soviet Republic of Armenia. In the Soviet Union, if you listen to the recordings of a certain period of the 15 republics, they look like each other, with certain melodic differences and that kind of stuff. And so the Armenians, as a state nation, they decided to get to stay closer to the Western system in order to avoid to any resemblance to what they call Turkish, which would be for me the big Middle Eastern family of modal music. And they tried to cut the links with this, and they still continue, and it is now an established tradition among Armenians with the polyphonic choral music, and only chromatically arranged folk music and these things. But it doesn't mean that everything else has been suppressed or disappeared. They just that the national music propaganda is much more stronger. So anybody who goes on, for example, on the internet and looks for, you write down Armenian music, you will come across to national music examples, and not all the others, which, if you put them together, maybe it makes a huge amount of different approaches, different styles, different kinds of music. So it's more a political question and not musical.
Thank you. I have a question here, which I think applies to both of your papers, and I think we have time for one, maybe another short question before we have a short break at 2:15. So Peter McMurray says, it's fascinating presentations, and thank you to both of you. Aram mentioned the emergence of new Greek notation systems around 1814, and same sorts of dynamics came up in Jacob's paper. To what degree were these musicians using these systems aware of those developments in other communities, I guess in a deep sense, and seeing these parallels between the two? Maybe Jacob, you'd like to start with this.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the question, Peter. Well, they were very aware, actually, of what was happening, and Limongian himself, Hampartsoum Notation, who is credited with inventing the system, although, as Aram said, it was a kind of collective effort. He is said to have learned, or he says himself, that he learned Ipsaltica, so he learned Greek chant and notation. And he, as far as I remember, Aram can correct me on that if I'm mistaken, but he first experimented with the old Greek neumes. Haig can say a lot about this as well, before he developed the system of Hampartsoum Notation. Yeah, so, and I think within the Greek community, there is a story that comes from a source published in the 1890s that Limongian was actually taught by Petros Peloponnesos, which is probably not true, but yeah, there's a lot of context, and it was fairly common, relatively common for Armenian cantors to learn Greek chant. So there's lots of connections between them.
Maybe you have some thoughts on this too. I guess it relates a lot to the theme of the nationalization of these traditions after the 19th century, which you've brought up in a very different previous situation.
Well, I personally don't think that at the beginning of the 19th century, the creation of these notations were directly linked to nationalist movements. They were really corresponded to a practical need. And the world was a bit different at that time, apparently. So they created something for the Jacob put a mention of Pezeshkian's mention, who was saying, well, we tried to do something, a notation, to create a notation system which could also help the others, the Ottomans, the Greeks, to write down. It comes from the Pezeshkian's 1815 manuscript. So they were trying to resolve a problem which concerned them, and it's not a coincidence that it was called church notation at the beginning. They needed it, and also as being the Ottoman identity, as having the Ottoman identity at the same time, they naturally thought that this could serve the others too. So having different notation systems between Greeks and Armenians didn't stop them to collaborate on many musical aspects. Some Greeks sang at the Armenian church, and some Armenians sang at the Greek church. I personally met 2 Armenians who had sung at the Greek church. Even, I mean, I'm a generation which is really the Ottoman Istanbul didn't exist anymore. So I don't think it's a national music problem at that time.
Well, thank you. That brings us nicely on time to the end of this first session. We're going to take a short 15-minute break now. The Zoom room will stay open. Please do stay in the room, and we'll come back for the next session. But thank you so much to Jacob and to Aram for opening the day so wonderfully, and for getting us off to such a good start. Thank you very much.